Yeah.
You know, last year I was wondering how I was going to get back home after they went out on strike.
Yeah.
I learned that Lillian was going down to Asheville, North Carolina to a church conference, so I got the job of driving her car down. Well, we drove down to Pittsburgh and we waited there overnight for another woman coming from Holland, Michigan. Funny thing about it, right the first year, there was an old spirit prophet told me that he see me making a journey and he see me go to a place where we wait for someone else coming from another section of the country, and then we'd make this journey together. I thought this thing wasn't going to come off at all until this woman rather, was coming from Holland, Michigan. We met her in Pittsburgh. So sure enough, that was the fulfillment of that prophecy that I had early in the year.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we stayed there overnight, and then we started out for Asheville, North Carolina. And I drove the car, and of course we made pretty good time. So this woman from Michigan, she thought she going to get me interested in a religious discussion, but I started talking to her about life everlasting and communicating with the so-called dead. She didn't want any part of that. So anyway, we got down there to a place near Nashville. We didn't go directly there, and I left those people there and took a bus at Asheville and started for home down to Tampa. Well, the buses were crowded because the airlines were all out on strike. So a number of people boarded and got out at different places. At Macon, Georgia, a little old woman got on the bus, and she busied herself getting a bunch of parcels put up over her head, and finally she sat down, and I said to her, "What did you do with your lunch?" Oh, she says, "I left it in the other bus." I went back to get it, and a couple of men were in there cleaning up, and one of them got it. And she sat there for a little while, and finally she said to me, "How come you know so much about me?" Well, I says, "I was reading your mind." Well, then she got in conversation with a woman across the aisle, and they were talking about someone who they both knew that had died. And they were talking about the funeral and everything, and I says, while she was talking there, I could feel the presence of an entity that she had known. And I jabbed her in the ribs with my elbow, and I says to her, "What do you think happens to people when they die?" She says, "Well, sir, I think when people die, they go right straight to heaven and live forever." I told her, I said, "Well, in a way, you're part right."
Yeah.
I said, "You do live forever." Then I says to her, I said, "Would you recognize a young man well, he's about 2 inches taller than you are, and he's real thin." I says, "He's been sick quite a long time. I would say that he passed out of the body with tuberculosis." She said, "I don't know him." Well, I said, "You ought to know this fellow because it's your brother." She sat there a little while and finally says, "You say he's real thin and about 2 inches taller than me?" And I said, "Yeah, that's my brother. But he ain't dead." Well, I said, "Sometimes," I says, "I can feel the ailments of people who's still in the body." I said, and I could feel his condition. I said, "But I will tell you that he's had tuberculosis for about 5 years, and I says, he will pass out from it." She said, "He'd been real sick a long time." Well, she finally got to her destinations in the eastern part of Georgia, and she got out, and as I rode along, we finally got to Jacksonville, Florida, and then over to what the heck is the name of the town now? Gainesville.
Gainesville.
Yeah, a woman got on there at Gainesville, and She was in her 60s. She got settled down and seated alongside me, and she says, I come out here to visit my mother-in-law. Says, when my husband was living, we used to come out and visit her, and that wasn't too bad, but coming out on the bus, it makes an awful hard job. She said, I lost my husband last November. Well, as she was telling me, I could feel his presence very clearly there, and I says to her, how many times have you seen your husband since he left the body? And she said, why should you ask that? I said, because you have seen him 3 different times, and one time you were carrying on a conversation with him, and you finally realized that he had passed out of the body, and I said, you really got a little scared because you began to wonder if you were losing your mind. And she said, well, how can you tell that? Well, I said, your husband is right here. And I says, I feel impressed that he had made 3 visits, and on one of these visits you were talking to him and he was talking to you. Until you got scared. And I says, while we've been riding along, I've tried to figure out what caused his death. And I said, he didn't have a death that would leave any mark on him because he died very peacefully. And I said, do you mind telling me what caused his death? She said, well, he woke me up one morning at 2 o'clock. He was sitting in the bed, sitting beside the bed, and I asked him if everything was all right, and he says, I don't know, but I'm hemorrhaging. And she said before I could get a doctor or get him to the hospital, he passed out. And a post-mortem showed that he had cancer, but evidently he didn't know anything about it. And the cancer had eaten into one of the main arteries, and he bled inside. So she says, and you really could feel the presence of my husband? I said, certainly I did. I said, didn't I describe to you? And the condition he went through, leaving the body, but he didn't have any pain or anything. So she wanted to know more about it, and I told her where the church was there in Sarasota. That's where she was living. A week later, he visited the church where I was at and made himself known so that I would know that he had made this trip with us. But of course you can't always tell about what's going to happen.
You're not very good at predicting the future, huh?
Oh, I can predict the future all right. I run into a lot of things. Sometimes the things come out just like I see them, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it takes years. And once it goes over a period of 10, 15 years, you almost forget about it until it really happens. Then you realize that you had seen it. You foresaw this thing.